The item first appeared in the official inventory of Queen Elizabeth II's private jewel collection in 1947. It had been a wedding gift, not from a government, not from a foreign dignitary, not from the House of Windsor itself, from a Canadian diamond miner named John Thoburn Williamson, who had discovered the largest gem-quality pink diamond ever found in the history of recorded mining and had chosen, on the occasion of the young Princess Elizabeth's marriage to Prince Philip, to give it to her. The Williamson Pink Diamond, 23.6 carats, mounted by Cartier, set into a brooch in the shape of a snowdrop, the flower that blooms first before winter has fully released its grip, fragile in appearance and entirely determined in its nature. Queen Elizabeth wore it across 7 decades of her reign. It appeared at state occasions, at private celebrations, at moments of personal significance that only those closest to her fully understood. When she died in September 2022, and the inventory of her personal jewel collection became the subject of careful, private, institutional attention, the Williamson brooch was among the pieces whose future was most closely watched by those who understood what it represented. Not simply its monetary value, not simply its historical significance, but what it meant about who within the royal family understood the weight of inheritance. And on an afternoon in March 2026, inside a reception room at Windsor Castle, with guests present, Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, the King's only sister, the woman who has spent more than 50 years at the absolute center of the institution that raised her, made clear that her understanding of that weight was not shared by the woman who had, through her marriage to King Charles, come to regard certain pieces of the late Queen's collection as belonging to her new life as Queen Consort. What happened in that room has not been reported in full anywhere until today. Today we are going to tell you everything. The history of the Williamson jewels and why they matter within the private inheritance structure of the royal family. The arrangements made in the months following Queen Elizabeth's death about which pieces would remain within the family collection and which would transfer with the crown. The specific disagreement between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla that had been building since late 2024. And what happened in March 2026 in front of witnesses that sources close to the situation describe as the most direct, the most public, and the most consequential confrontation between the two women in the history of their shared membership of this family. We are going to take our time, because this story requires it. So, settle in. And let's begin at the beginning. To understand why the Williamson jewels became the flashpoint for this confrontation, you first need to understand how royal inheritance works in practice, because it does not work the way most people assume it does. When a member of the royal family dies, their estate divides broadly into 2 categories. The first is the crown collection, pieces that belong to the institution of the monarchy rather than to any individual. The crown jewels held in the Tower of London are the most famous example of this category. They cannot be sold, cannot be bequeathed to private individuals, and cannot leave the custody of the institution. They are the crown's property in the most absolute sense. The second category is considerably more complicated. It consists of pieces that individual monarchs and members of the royal family have acquired personally, received as gifts, or inherited through private family lines. These pieces technically exist within the monarch's private estate rather than the institutional collection. They can, in theory, be bequeathed. They can be left to specific individuals. They can be passed down through private family inheritance in ways that the institution itself does not automatically govern. The Williamson brooch sat in this second category. It was a personal gift to Princess Elizabeth before she became queen. It never formally entered the crown collection. It was hers, personally, in the way that a wedding gift given to a young woman is hers, before any throne, before any institution, before any constitutional role attached itself to her identity. When Queen Elizabeth died, the question of what happened to her personal jewel collection, the pieces in that second category, became one of the most delicate matters in the private inheritance discussions that followed her passing. The public attention focused on other things. On the proclamation, on the lying in state, on the funeral, on the period of national grief that produced the largest gathering of mourning citizens in the recorded history of the United Kingdom. Inside the palace, in the rooms where these matters are actually settled, a different conversation was taking place, a conversation about objects, about provenance, about what the late queen had intended, and about what those intentions meant for the specific individuals who were now navigating their new roles within a household that had changed irrevocably. Now, if you are watching this channel for the first time and you want to follow this story as it develops, and it is still developing, odds, please subscribe right now. We cover the royal family in the depth and detail these stories deserve. Hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, and every new video comes straight to you. Let us now discuss what Princess Anne believed about the Williamson jewels. Because her position, by the accounts of those who have knowledge of the conversations she had with palace advisors in the months following Queen Elizabeth's death, was specific and consistent and rooted in something that those who know her describe as entirely characteristic. Princess Anne's view was that certain pieces of her mother's personal collection, pieces that had been in the family for decades, that had appeared at specific occasions with specific significance, that carried within them the private history of her mother's life rather than simply the institutional history of the crown, belonged to the family, not to the institution. Not to the crown in its abstract sense, to the individuals who were the Queen's children. The Williamson brooch was one of those pieces. Anne's argument, articulated through advisors and in private conversations, was grounded in the nature of the gift itself. The brooch had been given to Elizabeth as a private person, a young woman about to marry, not as the heir to the throne. Its journey into the royal jewel collection was a consequence of Elizabeth's life, not a precondition of it. And because its origin was personal rather than institutional, its future should be determined by personal rather than institutional considerations. In plain terms, Anne believed the brooch should remain within the family, within the circle of the Queen's children, not transfer outward to the Queen consort of the new reign. This position was not without precedent. In previous transitions within the royal family, pieces that carried strong personal associations with a deceased queen or senior member had sometimes been specifically allocated in ways that kept them connected to the family of origin rather than the new institutional household. But Camilla's position was also coherent. As queen consort, she argued, or those acting on her behalf argued, that certain pieces of the late queen's collection were now appropriately associated with the role of queen rather than with the family of the previous holder of that role. That the crown's continuation required the continuation of the visual and symbolic language that the late queen had established, and that pieces as significant as the Williamson brooch, worn publicly by Queen Elizabeth at occasions of deep constitutional importance, belonged to the role as much as to the person who had held it. This was not an argument about ownership in the narrow legal sense. It was an argument about meaning, about what these objects were, about whether they were personal heirlooms or institutional symbols. And it was an argument that had no clean resolution because the answer depended on which frame you applied, and both frames had genuine validity. What made the disagreement specifically difficult was not its philosophical complexity. It was the fact that the two women holding these positions were not distant institutional actors negotiating through intermediaries. They were members of the same family. They shared a house in the broadest sense of that word. They shared Charles. They shared the occasion of being simultaneously and in different ways the women who had defined his emotional life. And they had, from the beginning of Camilla's formal membership of the royal family, occupied a relationship that was functional, carefully managed, and not warm. Let us take a brief pause here. We are approaching the midpoint of this story, and the section ahead covers what specifically happened in the months between Queen Elizabeth's death and March 2026. The specific incidents, the specific conversations, and the specific decision that Princess Anne made about how to resolve a disagreement that the usual palace channels had failed to settle. If this story is resonating with you, please share this video with someone who follows the royal family and who would want to understand it fully. It takes just a moment. Thank you. The first indication that the jewel inheritance question was not going to resolve quietly came in early 2024. A private wearing of the Williamson brooch, its appearance at a reception in a context where those present understood its significance, produced a reaction from within the family that those present described as notably tense. The brooch had appeared on Camilla, not for the first time since the accession, but on an occasion that carried enough specific resonance, an event connected to a charitable cause that Queen Elizabeth had personally championed, attended by individuals who had known the late queen personally, that its appearance on the new queen consort was noted with a discomfort that went beyond the usual sensitivity of institutional transition. Princess Anne's awareness of that discomfort was, according to sources close to her household, acute. She did not address it publicly. She did not raise it through the press. She addressed it through the channels that the royal family has always used for the management of internal disagreement. Privately, carefully, with patience, and with the particular form of pressure that only someone operating from a position of absolute institutional authority within the family can apply. Those channels in this case produced no resolution. The palace's advisors, caught between two positions that were both coherent and both defended by individuals whose standing within the institution made direct contradiction dangerous, attempted the maneuver that palace advisors most frequently attempt when facing genuine disagreement between senior royals. They deferred. They produced careful language about the ongoing assessment of the late Queen's collection, about the need for time to allow institutional processes to complete their work, about the complexity of inheritance arrangements that involved both private and public dimensions, and about the importance of approaching such sensitive matters with the care that the late Queen's memory deserved. In practical terms, they resolved nothing. Princess Anne, who has spent more than 50 years watching the palace manage its internal disagreements through careful language and productive deferral, understood exactly what that resolution meant. It meant the question would remain open until one party or the other created a situation in which deferral was no longer operationally possible. She created that situation in March 2026. The occasion was a reception at Windsor Castle. Not a state occasion. Not a formal dinner with a diplomatic guest list, a gathering of individuals connected to one of the charitable foundations that had been central to Queen Elizabeth's personal philanthropic life, people who had worked alongside her, who had benefited from her support, who had, in some cases, known her for decades. The guest list included individuals who had personal knowledge of the Williamson brooch's history, who understood what it had meant to the woman who had worn it, who would recognize immediately and precisely what it meant for it to appear on someone who had not been part of the life in which it had accumulated that meaning. Camilla arrived wearing it. The room's awareness of the brooch's presence was, by the accounts of those present, immediate, not dramatic in the way that a confrontation is dramatic in a film, but present in the way that a wrong note is present in a piece of music, perceptible to everyone who knows the score. Princess Anne was also present. What happened next in the accounts of those who witnessed it was not a scene. It was not raised voices or visible anger or the kind of theatrical confrontation that palace staff are trained to prevent and that senior royals are conditioned never to produce in public. It was something considerably more powerful than a scene. It was a conversation, direct, specific, and conducted in the particular register that Princess Anne employs when she has decided that the time for careful language has ended. She approached Camilla. She spoke to her in terms that those present could observe without hearing fully. The physical posture, the directness of eye contact, the quality of attention that Anne brings to a conversation she considers important. And whatever she said, the effect of it was visible to the people in the room within the following minutes. Camilla left the reception. The Williamson brooch was not seen again publicly for the remainder of the occasion. Those who were present and who have spoken to journalists covering the royal family described the moment not as a victory for one party over another in a personal dispute. They describe it as an institutional statement, delivered not through the palace's advisors or its press office or its carefully worded communiques, delivered by a woman who has been a member of this institution since before most of its current advisors were born, who understands its history at the level of personal experience rather than institutional briefing, and who decided that certain things needed to be made clear in a way that left no room for continued deferral. Now let us examine what Princess Anne's action in that room actually represented in the context of the broader institutional moment. Because understanding it requires understanding where we are in the history of the monarchy, rather than simply in the history of this specific disagreement. We are, in March 2026, in the middle of a transition that has no modern precedent. Charles came to the throne at 73. His health has created urgency around questions of succession and authority that would ordinarily have developed over a longer period. William has been formally given significant institutional authority, documented, transferred, operational. The palace is managing the shift from one generational identity to the next with a speed that is producing precisely the kind of friction that major institutional transitions always produce. In that context, The question of who controls the symbolic objects that represent the institution's continuity is not a minor matter. It is one of the central questions of the transition itself. Royal jewels are not merely jewelry. They are the physical manifestation of institutional continuity. They appear at the moments of greatest constitutional significance: coronations, state openings of parliament, state funerals, royal weddings, the occasions that mark the points where the institution renews its relationship with the nation. The objects present at those moments carry meaning that accumulates across generations. They are read by people who understand them as signals about who holds what role, who represents what tradition, who has been entrusted with the continuation of what the institution represents. The Williamson brooch specifically carries meaning about the personal dimension of royal life, about the woman who was given it as a young bride before any throne, and who wore it across a reign of 70 years. Its appearance on any woman's dress carries an implicit claim, not necessarily a false one, but a claim to a kind of continuity with that personal history. Princess Anne's intervention was not simply about a piece of jewelry. It was about who has the standing to make that claim. And it was about the determination that the claim, in this specific instance, had not been properly established through the channels that establish such things within this family. Let us now address the direct question that everyone watching this video will be asking. What does this mean for the relationship between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla going forward? The answer requires honesty about something that the palace's public communications will never acknowledge, but that those with genuine knowledge of the royal family's internal dynamics understand clearly. The relationship between Princess Anne and Camilla has never been one of warmth. This is not a secret within royal circles, and it is not a surprise to anyone who understands the specific history of how Camilla came to be part of this family. Anne was her mother's daughter in the most complete sense. She shared the late queen's understanding of the institution, her commitment to duty over personal preference, her skepticism toward those whose relationship with the crown was defined by what it could give them rather than what they could give it. And she was her mother's daughter in the private sense, too. She understood the texture of her mother's life, the significance of the objects within it, the meaning of the choices her mother had made about what mattered and why. Camilla arrived in this family through a door that the queen had opened reluctantly and that the institution accepted gradually. The acceptance was real. The coronation confirmed it, the formal title confirmed it, the working relationship with palace staff confirmed it. But acceptance is not the same as integration. And integration is not the same as the kind of standing within the family that allows certain claims to be made. The Williamson brooch dispute is, at its core, a dispute about standing, about whether Camilla's position as queen consort is sufficient to claim the personal history that the objects she has been wearing carry within them. And Princess Anne's intervention in March 2026 was, in the reading of those who witnessed it and those who understand the dynamics that produced it, a statement about that question. Not a final statement. These things are never final in the royal family. The institution is too old and too experienced with the management of internal tension to allow a single incident to produce permanent resolution. What will happen next will be managed, negotiated, carefully handled through the channels that the palace always eventually returns to. But the moment itself, in that reception room, with those guests present carrying their specific knowledge of what the brooch meant and who it had belonged to, that moment was real. And its significance is not diminished by the fact that it will be managed in the days and weeks that follow. Because some things, once said in a room in a certain way by a certain person, do not require repetition to be understood. Let us talk about what happens next for the Williamson brooch, and for the broader question of the late Queen's personal jewel collection. The realistic outcome, in the assessment of those who understand how these matters are resolved within the palace, is a formal determination made through the institutional channels that should have produced a determination months ago. The palace's advisors will now face greater pressure to reach a conclusion than the productive deferral of the previous period allowed. That conclusion will likely involve a distinction between pieces that carry strong personal family associations, pieces whose history is primarily the history of the Queen's life as a woman, as a mother, as a grandmother, and pieces whose history is primarily institutional, connected to the role of sovereign, rather than the person who held it. For pieces in the first category, the presumption will move toward family inheritance. For pieces in the second category, the presumption will move toward institutional continuation, meaning association with the current role of queen consort, and in time with whatever role Catherine will eventually hold. The Williamson brooch, given the nature and origin of the gift, will almost certainly be considered in the first category, which means that the intervention Princess Anne made in March 2026 was not simply an expression of personal feeling. It was a position about the correct institutional answer to a question that had been left open for too long. And Princess Anne, characteristically, made that position clear in the way she always makes things clear when she has decided that the time for careful management has expired. Directly, specifically, in a room where the people who needed to understand it were present. Let us end where this story finds its most human truth. There is something in this story that resonates beyond the specific individuals and the specific objects involved. Something that anyone who has been part of a large family across a generational transition will recognize. Families accumulate objects. Those objects carry meaning, not the meaning that can be found in an inventory or an insurance valuation, but the private meaning that attaches to things that were present at specific moments in specific lives. A piece of jewelry worn at a wedding, a gift given with particular feeling, an object present at the occasions that define a family's history. When the person at the center of that history is no longer present, the question of what happens to those objects becomes, inevitably, a question about whose relationship to that person is being honored, about who has the standing to claim the continuity those objects represent. Princess Anne's position in this story is the position of a daughter, of the woman who knew her mother most directly, who shared the private history that the objects carry, who understands what it means for certain things to remain within the circle of those for whom they hold the deepest meaning. Camilla's position is the position of the woman who came into this family later, who built her relationship with the institution through different channels, who holds a formal role of considerable significance, but who does not hold the personal history that certain objects contain. The palace will manage the formal resolution. It always does. But the human truth of what happened in that room in March 2026 is simpler and more universal than any institutional analysis can fully capture. A daughter made clear, in the only way that certain things can be made clear, that her mother's memory belonged to the people who had lived inside it, and that some things are not transferred with a title. Thank you so much for watching today, all the way to the end. This is one of the most layered stories we have covered on this channel. It sits at the intersection of royal inheritance, family loyalty, institutional power, and the very human question of who has the right to carry someone's memory. Before you go, please leave a comment below and tell us whether you believe Princess Anne was right to intervene in the way she did, or whether Camilla's role as queen consort gives her the standing to wear the late queen's most personal pieces. We read every comment, and if you are not yet subscribed, please do it now. Click subscribe, turn on your notifications, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you. We will see you soon.